Hello and welcome to this episode of Epochs, where we shall be talking all about the Anglo-Zulu War of the 19th century. And I am joined by Nick Hughes. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thanks. And hello to everybody watching.
Yeah, thanks for your time. It's a really interesting topic, this. There's quite a lot to say about it, even though in the grand scheme of the history of war, it's quite a small affair, I think. Nonetheless.
6 months, is it? Tops?
Sorry?
It takes place over 6 months.
Right, yeah, 6 or 7 months, yeah. And like the casualties in the scheme of things aren't very big and all that sort of thing. But it's got all sorts of cultural repercussions, because where we're going to talk about the Anglo-Zulu War, which took place in like the 1878 to 79, mainly in 1879, there's the film Zulu and also Zulu Dawn. And so we're going to just talk about everything to do with this topic. So I thought maybe if it's all right with you, I could sort of just do a few quick minutes, sort of setting up the sort of the background to it. So very quickly, because we want to get onto the events of that year, and the famous battles. Europeans had been sailing around the Cape, the bottom of Africa there, since sort of the 14th, 15th century. But it wasn't until the very, very early 19th century, the Napoleonic era, when Britain relieved the Dutch of control of the Cape, basically. And over the next few decades, we get more and more traders in there, more and more missionaries and things. And in the end, it became the Cape Colony, or Natal. And so by the 1870s, we'd basically sort of, without even really trying as such, that's the story of the British Empire in all sorts of ways, isn't it? Without even really explicitly trying, just pushed more and more inland until we come up against the sort of the biggest, most powerful tribe in South Africa, which was the Zulu. And they'd consolidated their power in the last few centuries, going back to the great Shaka Zulu himself. But by the 1870s, they were a little bit, I'll put a map up so everyone can see, they're sort of sandwiched between the Boer republics and Natal. And so that's sort of, in a very, very, very brief nutshell, where we find ourselves.
Yes.
And if you want to say any words on that.
One thing about Shaka as well is that he was relatively new. The Zulus were a tribe. They were rivaling the Bantus in the region. And they did have a kind of military culture, but it wasn't as advanced or as sophisticated until Shaka came along. And that's 1800 to 1820. So he's only 60 years gone by the time the Zulu Wars. He really does revolutionize the Zulu fighting spirit and the tactics. You know, the famous, which we'll get to, the famous bull head tactic is an invention of Shaka's. And so the thing is, he's still within living memory of the eldest Zulu tribes and of some of the eldest Boers and British settlers, that his shadow is still lingering. And people think he was like hundreds of years ago before the Zulu War. No, he wasn't. He was only 60, 70 years before.
I've heard somebody say, I think this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it still gives a good impression, that Shaka sort of reorganised Zulu society on some level along some of, in the vein of the Spartans. In other words, nothing really like the ancient Greek Spartans, but all boys, all men, from sort of as soon as you're big and strong enough, from the age of 15 or 16 or so, you're expected to become a warrior on some level. If your great chieftain asks you to, you're expected to fight for him. One thing to say straight off the bat, the leader of the Zulu is a chap called Cachuwayu. So he'll be the leader all throughout this story is Cachuwayu. And so one of the things to say is that the Spartan thing is maybe a bit overblown, but it certainly was a martial society, wasn't it? It certainly was very martial.
This is a kind of bubbling under the surface, a cause for the war itself. Because what you have is that it's a very sophisticated martial society. And the British and the Boers treat the Zulus with quite a lot of respect in that period between when they make contact, I think between 1810 and 1820. And between the Zulu War, there's a kind of respect. You don't want to mess with these guys. You know, you get caught out, they will absolutely destroy you. And so the British government, we'll probably get to this in more detail, but the British government back in London do not want to poke the hornet's nest. But the people on the ground in Natal are going to poke it for reasons. But the thing is, so the British treat the Zulus with quite a bit of respect, and deservedly so. And we see how this plays out in the war when you have the advanced technological army versus the highly sophisticated, very well organized, extremely well motivated and determined technological inferior.
Yeah,
and it's kind of asymmetric in that way.
No, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the things, just like the real reality of it right off the bat. They've just got spears, and we've got the Martini Henry rifle, we've got cannon, we've got all sorts of.
But we've got cavalry as well.
Right? Yeah,
they don't need it.
Yeah, they're not really mounted, are they?
No, or at all. I mean, maybe a chieftain will have a horse, but that horse will be captured from an enemy. It won't be one that they've reared themselves for the purpose. But then the Zulu army is trained to run from battlefield to battlefield. It's a bit like the Greeks. Again, we're going back to the Spartan Greek thing of running to the battle, fighting a battle, having just a brief rest, and then running to the next battle. Their speed on foot is incredible.
Yeah, someone said, I can't remember where the quote is, but it's an actual quote from the time. Maybe it's in the film Zulu where it says, how far can you march? And they said, we could do 15, 20 miles. And they say, the Zulu do 50 in a day. But it's one thing to say, actually, just to mention about the Zulus have only got spear. They do have, again, it was from a quote from the time, that they do have, I think it was from Chelmsford himself, said that they do have some muskets. And occasionally they did actually end up capturing a few Martini Henry rifles and things, but not very many, and they're not great shots with them exactly. So yeah, it's very true. It's absolutely true to say it's asymmetrical on the technological side of things. But they've got numbers because we were never there in giant numbers.
No.
So one thing to say then, just to set it up, is sort of the causes for the war. Our Prime Minister at the time was Disraeli, Benjamin Disraeli, and I think it's fair to say we're sort of the higher Victorian period, isn't it? The late 70s, late 1870s. And Disraeli said in Parliament, he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, never before has England been so powerful. There's various zeniths of the British Empire, and you can argue when they were, sort of perhaps before we lost the Americas. But this is one of them in the sort of the 1870s, 1880s, 90s, where you could argue perhaps the British Empire is at one of its zeniths. And we were just extremely confident. And we hadn't really had any sort of giant, massive humiliations and losses. And that's one of the sort of takeaway headlines of the Anglo-Zulu War, is that we are humbled for one of the first times.
Yeah. I think what you have is, in the aftermath of the Indian Mutiny and the Crimean War, it shows a lot of flaws in the empire and in the British Army in particular. The Navy, the Royal Navy, just seems to coast through the period at a level of peak efficiency. But the Army, at the end of the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny, there are problems with the Army.
And that's like the 1850s, just to say.
1850s. So what happens is there's a big effort. A new generation of officers kind of come to the fore, of which Sir Garnet Wolseley is perhaps the most famous and most effective. But they come in the aftermath of clearing out Lord Raglan, the Earl of Cardigan, all those old guard of generals. I think the purchase system for officer ranks is abolished in this time. There's more emphasis on the technical departments, the engineering, the logistics, the artillery. They're not seen as, unfashionable. This is where the poor officers go to have a military career. There's more emphasis down the road from where I live, Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. That's in full swing. And so the British Army goes through this period of restructuring and improvement. The old muzzle-loaded muskets go. It's replaced with a kind of interim breech-loading musket before going to the Martini Henry, I think, in the late 1860s. And so it's all coming together. And also, the administration of the empire is going through a change after the Indian Mutiny. Canada becomes a dominion in the 1860s, and that's seen as the model of how the empire is going to go. All these little provinces are going to get consolidated. They're going to have a different government style system to make the empire more efficient. So in the 1870s, I would say the empire is working not just militarily efficient, but administratively it's efficient. And so this is the backdrop. And now we have in the South African colonies a very ambitious chancellor of a governor. And he sees Sir Bartle Frere, he sees Canada and he says, I want to be the guy for South Africa. What I can't remember who he's the guy who had his statue vandalized, I think, last year.
Oh, yeah, I can't remember who.
It's that governor who is the first governor of a dominionized Canada. And Sir Bartle Frere, who we'll talk about, he's got similar ambitions.
Okay, yeah, so just to set up the leadership then, with Ketchaway as the leader of the Zulus, we've got, obviously, Queen Victoria at the head of everything, but the great queen, the queen of all Africa, the Empress, and then Disraeli, Disraeli obviously as PM. But on the ground there, sort of the two leaders, you mentioned there, Sir Bartle Frere, who's sort of the political overlord in Natal, and the military man, the Lord General, the Lord Chelmsford, who's, he's the head military man. So between him and Henry Bartle Frere, they're sort of they're the guys that sort of make all these decisions, aren't they? And so let's get into it. I mean, why was it that we seem to have lived quite peacefully for decades right next to Zululand, and the frontier was the Buffalo River? Why was it that we lived really quite peacefully, it seems, more or less anyway, next to the Zulu for a long time, and suddenly, well, wasn't suddenly exactly, but it seems like we sort of manufacture a casus belli against them. What are your thoughts and feelings about that episode?
Well, it's in the wake of, as I said, the Canada becoming a dominion, and that goes very successfully and a peaceful transition from the provinces to the dominion. And Sir Bartle Frere, Henry Bartle Frere, has a similar idea. But what he's got the mostly English Cape Colony. He's got Natal and the Orange Free State, which Natal is 50-50 Boer and English. Orange Free State is predominantly Boer. And then the fourth part is Zululand. And he has an idea, okay, we'll have all four of them united. Now, at the time, Orange Free State was and Natal were going through economic hardships. So they were kind of amenable to the idea, yeah, we'll have the richer Cape subsidizing us if we come together. But I think it was Frere's predecessor, I can't remember the name of the guy, but in the 1860s, he was saying, you can't have the Zulus, you can't have this armed militaristic nation on our doorstep, these savages, that's his words, not mine, but you can't have them.
Was it Lord Carnarvon, possibly? Was it Lord Carnarvon?
No, was it Lord Carnarvon? I can't remember the guy's name. But Frere's kind of buying into this. No, we can't have this armed, all-warrior nation on our doorstep. Because what happens when you have a highly militarized nation where every male is a warrior and there's no war? And this kind of the British thinking is, at some point, they're going to want, all that pent-up militarism and testosterone is going to burst. And it's going to burst into our borders. So why don't we do a preemptive strike? However, this is a huge misreading of the Zulus and the Zulu Code of Honor, because they'd given the government in London assurances that they weren't going to kick off. And they hadn't kicked off, apart from some skirmishes with some Boer settlers. They had not come together as an entire nation to attack its neighbours. And so the Zulu sense of honour, your queen said we could exist as our kingdom. We're keeping that end of the bargain, and London's keeping that end of the bargain. And this is the thing, Bartle Frere and Chelmsford want this war to be over before London can react.
Mm-hmm.
This is a huge driver because London, the government, the Colonial Office, is highly likely to say, you are not doing this.
Mm-hmm.
We are not going to go to war with the best African kingdom. We're not doing this. So because there've been some 1860s with the Maoris as well. That was a close run affair for a while. We didn't, again, not a lot of British soldiers, but a very highly motivated Maori army. And so I think Disraeli was off the idea. He was kind of in the 1870s. He wanted to kind of consolidate and be peaceful and expand the empire diplomatically rather than, sending troops on the ground. So there is this thing that there is this rift between Cape Town and London.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Disraeli wasn't sort of a crazed imperialist. Well, of course, he was an imperialist, but, he wasn't chomping at the bit to try and dominate Zululand. It wasn't like that at all. You're absolutely right. Let's get into some of the detail and the mechanics of how Bartle Frere sort of makes it happen, because there's the idea of, finding a reason for war, a casus belli. So there were, I think the Zulus did, there was a story, I think it's true, that the Zulus had been sort of executing some people in a sort of, as far as we're concerned, in an extrajudicial sense. I think even some of them sort of within sight of the missionary post at Rorke's Drift. But anyway, the Bartle Frere sort of basically says to the Zulus, I don't think we can allow you to sort of exist using your own sense of the rule of law. That Cachuwayu is, he tried to frame him, or did frame him, as sort of a tyrant type figure, that his word was law, and the crown just simply couldn't have that. What's your understanding of all this?
I think the allegations are somewhat true, but it's like taking the worst reading of Cachuwayu's power and the Zulu legal system. It's saying, okay, these things did happen. As I said, there were clashes between the Zulus and, say, Boer settlers in particular along the borders, but it was never, the Zulus never massed as an army to do this. And yes, there are impetuous young warriors and tribal leaders who, want to make a bit of a name for themselves within the court of Cachuwayu. So they're doing their own little preemptive raid to say, see, I'm a great warrior. I can take responsibility. So there is that. But this is all stuff that could have been negotiated. And this is all stuff that could have been dissipated. But Frere's that's not his grand vision. His grand vision is this dominion of South Africa. And so he's taking the worst reading of what the Zulu are doing and just using that as the pretext, so that when the Colonial Office does come calling and saying, what are you doing? He said, well, these are the reasons. This is why I'm doing this. So yeah. he's got his get out clause.
He needed to be able to point to something at the very least. Yeah. Right. So where we get into this here, there are two famous films. There's the film Zulu with Michael Caine, which we will talk all about probably in a bit after we talk about the
history.
And there's the other film, Zulu Dawn, which came out it was quite soon before.
It was 1978.
Right. Okay. So
that's 14 years.
Right. Now in Zulu Dawn, with Peter O'Toole plays Chelmsford. It's got Burt Lancaster in it. It's a good film. It's worth watching, I think.
Is it? Yes,
Yeah. I quite like Zulu Dawn. I rewatched it. I rewatched both films actually in preparation for this, but I'd forgotten how good Zulu Dawn was. Anyway, in that you do actually see that a lot of the sort of British settlers in Natal, they sort of knew that it was essentially trumped up charges against the Zulu, although the Zulu hadn't been, absolutely perfect neighbours. They hadn't really done anything to sort of bring down the whole British army on their heads. But one thing you do see Cachuwayu say is that, in the most general sense, this idea that, you have your laws in your colony, in your bit of land, and I'll have my laws. And it's difficult to argue with that, really. Even though, as far as we're concerned, it might be a type of unbridled law where, extrajudicial killings go on. But, I mean, what do you think about that argument that it's their land, it's their culture, they should be free, at least within reason, to do what they want? He's not sort of, going around impaling tens of thousands of people on a whim because he's insane. Yeah. He wasn't doing anything like that.
No,
so there's also just one more quick thing to say, like the example in India where we would see sooty, where men would burn women folk alive and things like this. And we just said, look, we don't care that it's your culture. We're not going to have it. We hang men that burn women alive. That's the end of the story. So there's that end of the scale of this argument. And the other end of the scale is let them do what they want. Who are we to tell them what they can or can't do? What are your feelings about that?
Well, I think what happens when you look at the empire as a whole, and it is shifting in some cultures. The British just go, we're not going to interfere. That's what they do. But other areas like, in particular, Borneo and India, the British imposed themselves legally and morally. And when you look at it, I think in Borneo it was really to get rid of pirates. The piracy was a huge problem in the South China Sea, so it made sense for the British. You are harboring pirates, which is affecting our trade. Therefore, we're going to impose our law. I think in India, because the British Raj and the colonists and the administration were so intertwined with Indian society, you are going to have a clash where the two cultures come together. And the British are ultimately responsible and in charge. And they, in order to make this joint enterprise, as it were, work, the British have to impose their laws and just say, no, that culture, that tradition, that's got to go. And I think a lot of Indians were looking to the British. If you're an Indian widow, you're kind of looking to the British like, yeah, do something.
Right, yes.
And in the end, the tradition wasn't that missed. I think within a generation, Indians accept, it's, we didn't really need this. I think in this case of the Zulu, they are within the British sphere of influence, but they are left alone within that Zulu kingdom. There's not much interaction. The administration doesn't overlap with the Zulu royal family and the politics, apart from missionaries and maybe some traders. There's not that much interaction. There's not that much white Europeans going in to Zululand, and only in very small numbers. So it's you can't use that Indian argument in Zululand because it's doing its own thing. And I think this is what the Colonial Office in London were thinking, that, we are the Zulus affecting trade? Trade's always the biggest thing. With the British Empire, it's all about trade. Are they affecting trade? No. Are they bothering our settlers? Not really. Not to any large extent. Okay, leave it. We don't have to impose ourselves where we don't need to be.
Yeah. Now, it seems the way that the Anglo-Zulu War of 78, 79 seems to me one of the examples of where we could have just easily not done that, could have fairly easily avoided it. Again, going back to other examples of the British Empire where we seem to have got sort of sucked into things. I'm thinking about maybe the reconquest of the Sudan, or maybe when we first invaded Sindh in in the west of India, and all things as we sort of, without even exactly really meaning to, sort of get sucked into it. Or you get one of these political agents like Bartle Frere, who's sort of acting on his own initiative, where he hasn't really got the green light from Parliament or the Colonial Office or the Foreign Office or anything really. Again, I'm thinking of Sindh there. Just go ahead and do it. But nevertheless, Bartle Frere says, we're going to go into Zululand.
It's what I call Clive of India syndrome, where
right, yeah,
Clive of India is a what is he? He's just he's an administrator. He just happens to be a very talented general, but nobody knew that. And then under his initiative, we get India in the 1750s, in the 7 Years' War. And I think a lot of them, you look at McNaughton in the first Anglo-Afghan War, he's got ideas. He's going to be a new Clive of India. So every so often you find one of these guys and they think, I'm going to be the new Clive. And there was only one Clive.
I think Britain are involved in Afghanistan at this time as well, at the exact same time. Again, in India, just to mention Arthur Wellesley, or the Wellesley brothers, rather, Richard, his elder brother, saying, we really we kind of have to put down this thing here or there, Seringapatam or up in Pune, and sort of suddenly you find yourself, I'm accidentally controlling massive swathes of India without even having a grand design to do that.
I just wanted to put down a revolt on the border, and then this has to happen.
Whereas with Zululand, there wasn't like a pressing. Doesn't seem to me like there was a pressing need to do that. But there you go. So we probably could lay a lot of the blame at Sir Henry Bartle Frere's feet at this one.
And Chelmsford as well, because Chelmsford's a willing accomplice.
Absolutely. So let's push on into the details. So they do cross the border from the Tau into Zululand, crossing the Buffalo River there, and I'll put up maps again so people can see. Just on our side of the border, it's by the mountains, the Drakensberg Mountains. So just on our side of the border is a little missionary outpost at Rorke's Drift, which we will come back to, because that's what, if anyone knows, everyone should know. In the events of the film Zulu with Michael Caine, focus around that. But we'll come back to that in a bit. Because before that, we've got sort of the big event, Isindlwana. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. So Chelmsford marches across the border, and what has he got? He's got a few thousand men, sort of, it's the 24th Regiment, isn't it? A Welsh regiment.
Yeah, he's got 2 battalions of those. And most of the forces, more than half the forces, are made up of something called the Natal Native Contingent, which is a mixture of kind of part-time volunteer Boer farmers and landowners, and also, mostly Bantu Africans. And so Chelmsford, that's pretty much his force. And then he's got other ones. He's got a few engineers. He's got a little bit of Royal Artillery, and the logistics and the medical corps. And he divides his army forces up into 3 columns. And this is the controversial part, that he wants to get to Ulundi, the capital of the Zulu kingdom. But he decides he's going to approach it in 3 columns, because they're not quite sure where the Zulu army is going to be. So the idea is pretty much like a little bit Napoleonic in concept, that you'd have these corps, these 3 different forces moving. One would make contact, and then the other 2 would kind of swing into action. But it doesn't quite work out that way. Yeah.
So I think it's also got some rocket detachments. I know there's some guys with rockets. It's strange, isn't it? It's very sort of 19th century. And I think there's some mounted Natal police as well. are there. But anyway, he's got in the order of, what is it? I think 4,000 or 5,000 guys in total. And he does that classic, so he marches across the border, marches across the Buffalo River, comes up to this, and it's a big open countryside of South Africa there. And there's a small hill, which is Isandlwana. Isandlwana. That's what the South Africa, the Zulus call it. Some of the men thought it looked very, very vaguely like the outline of the Sphinx. So they called it the Sphinx. And actually that regiment, the 24th, had been in Egypt, sort of 60, 70 odd years before, fighting Napoleon, and one of their badges had the Sphinx on it, so they knew it very well anyway. They called it the Sphinx. And Chelmsford makes sort of a schoolboy error, doesn't he, to split his forces, as you mentioned there, making two or even three columns.
One of the columns again.
Right, okay.
So...
And that's a classic error, isn't it? You're told sort of, one of the things you never do is if you're in enemy territory, if you don't need to, don't split your forces up. That's sort of almost a golden rule. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, the early part of the campaign is marked by dodgy reconnaissance on the part of the British. This is the one area of service that really lets them down in the early part of the war. So he sends his scouts off in order to report back where the main Zulu army is, so the three columns can converge. And what happens is that one of these scouts spots a sizable Zulu force off to the east, and so they report back saying the Zulu army's to the east. But then the next group of scouts, they climb a hill. I'm not sure if it's the Isandlwana hill, but they climb a hill in the region, and they see some dust and stuff, but they can't see what turns out to be the main Zulu army. They just don't spot it. So Chelmsford says to the 1st Battalion of the 24th, you stay here. I'm going to ride off east to try and find this main Zulu army, and then I'll send for you once we've pinned it down. So he takes, again, he has his army in three columns. I can't remember if it's the number 2 or the number 3 column he's personally responsible for, but he splits that again and goes off east to find this Zulu army, which the scouts are telling him are the main Zulu army, but it's not.
Right.
It's actually, it's like the Zulus can do Napoleonic tactics as well, and that is the decoy force to pin the British into position while they maneuver their main army. And this is precisely what happens. Chelmsford, with half of his men, have gone east, and then they find out it's a decoy, but it's too late. The main Zulu army, about 30,000, are now onto 1,500 British soldiers left in command of the chief logistics officer, a Colonel Pulley, who's never held a field combat command ever. He's a great organizer. You want the supplies from A to B, you want the camps there, you want everybody fed, supplied. He's your man, but he's not he's just inexperienced, and he has his forces kind of spread out. He's put pickets here, pickets there, spread things out to cover all bases. And the military axiom: he who defends everything defends nothing.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.